Continuing with the calendar, page 32 of the printed version, House Bill 791, a bill to amend and reenact a section of the Code of Virginia relating to the Act for Religious Freedom. Report for the Committee on General Laws with an amendment.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move the committee amendment.
Questions on adoption of the committee amendment? As many as favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The amendment's agreed to. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members of the House, House Bill 791 amends Virginia Code Section 57-2, which affirms Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. In addition to updating the language used to affirm the Act, the bill makes clear that the rights that are there asserted are unalienable and that it is the policy of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I move that the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading.
The gentleman from Alexander.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak to the bill.
The gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, you and I and about half of this body the day before yesterday met in the colonial capital Williamsburg to celebrate a commemorative session all that our forefathers had done before. And in that chamber, we heard the very wise words of the president of William and Mary, who told us, in effect, that with age, we presume quality. I dare say the Statute for Religious Freedom, which is 230 years old this year, is one of the greatest documents, one of the greatest laws ever to come out of this body in its 400 years. At that time, men, women were killing each other on the basis for religion. Today, Mr. Speaker, men and women are killing each other on the basis of religion. Yet, in the United States of America, we have never had a religious war. And I dare say the great words of Thomas Jefferson are one of the main reasons why we have not had a religious war in this country. Those great words, which of course became part of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, protecting religious freedom. Mr. Speaker, these great words end in the Statute of Religious Freedom by Thomas Jefferson saying that we are free to declare and do declare that the rights hereby asserted are of the natural rights of mankind, and that if any act shall be hereafter passed to repeal the present or to narrow its operation, such act will be an infringement of natural right. Indeed, 70 years later, in 1849, still more than 170 years ago, the General Assembly adopted Section 57-2, which states, "The General Assembly doth now again declare that the rights asserted in the said act are of the natural rights of mankind." Mr. Speaker, you'll note that the General Assembly in the 1840s used the exact same language of Mr. Jefferson's words, "are of the natural rights of mankind." Mr. Speaker, HB 791 would change Jefferson's immortal language. It would change it to "are of the natural and unalienable rights of mankind." It also repeals the efforts of the General Assembly in the 1840s that said the General Assembly doth now again declare, and makes it modern language, saying the General Assembly does hereby declare again. Now, I have no doubt of the goodwill of the gentleman who's brought this bill forward, and had he simply said that this declaration is the policy of the Commonwealth of Virginia, I would wholeheartedly support this bill. But I would suggest to you, respectfully, Mr. Speaker, that the words of Thomas Jefferson do not need amending, do not need changing. I recognize that in modern times we are likely to change old statutes, but I would suggest that the flag sitting by you that says Sic Semper Tyrannis, there are some who don't understand what it means. We could modify the flag, put it in modern terms and say, "Thus always to tyrants," and then every school child would understand why there's a man lying on his back with his crown on the floor. We could take the coins that say "E pluribus unum" on them and say, you know, that's old language. It needs updating. Just say "of many one," or "we stick together." Mr. Speaker, we could stage Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. He said 77 years ago, but how many school children know that score means 20 years? We could remodify that, say 87 years ago, or perhaps to make it clear in 1776, so that no one has to do the math. Indeed, why not go back to Shakespeare? There are words of Shakespeare that are hard to understand today, Mr. Speaker. When Hamlet says "to be or not to be," a lot of people don't understand what he's talking about. Perhaps we should modify Hamlet and change it to the immortal words of The Clash, "Should I stay or should I go?" Then everyone would understand what Hamlet is trying to say. Mr. Speaker, Thomas Jefferson could not be here today, perhaps due to his age. At 272 years, he would have difficulty entering this chamber. But as one of the very first acts passed in Richmond, I dare say that Thomas Jefferson's language is good enough for me. I would say that when he said it is of the natural rights of mankind, that indeed is the language he chose to use, and that language should remain undisturbed. And I dare say that while I strongly support reaffirming this statute, that we not modify Thomas Jefferson's language, which is why I am opposed to this bill.
Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker?
The gentleman, Prince William, Mr. Marshall.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I would, sir.
Will the gentleman yield? Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, the author of the Declaration of Independence surely must be acknowledged by the gentleman to be the individual who was a president and governor and a member of this body, Thomas Jefferson. Now, this is what he said in his declaration, which was edited, but these are the remaining words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, the gentleman, Mr. Adams, has taken that identical word which Jefferson used, which apparently the gentleman finds some objection to in this context, on the one hand saying we should keep Jefferson's words, but on the other hand, we should not keep Jefferson's words. So since he used unalienable in the Declaration of Independence, what is wrong with the gentleman adding, and I acknowledge that I approach this with some degree of, trepidation because of the age of this document and the esteem with which it has been held. But it is a word that Jefferson used in his own declaration, so what would the problem be?
Indeed, sir, he used the word natural in the Statute of Religious Freedom. So by your analysis, we should modify the Declaration of Independence.
Mr. Speaker.
Excuse me, Mr. Speaker, may I respond?
Mr. Speaker. Point of order.
Gentleman has the floor.
I would ask the chair to remind the gentleman that he should address the chair and not other members of the body.
Just did.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
May I respond, Mr. Speaker?
Yes.
I would say that just as Thomas Jefferson used the word natural in the Statute of Religious Freedom, but he didn't use it in those words, the Declaration of Independence, if the gentleman is correct, we should indeed modify the Declaration of Independence so that it says that we are endowed by our Creator with certain natural and unalienable rights. But I would suggest that Thomas Jefferson's words are Thomas Jefferson's words. He used natural in one document, and he used unalienable in another document, and I would not presume to change the author of the Statute of Religious Liberties words. I would let them lie and perhaps reaffirm them. I would strongly support reaffirming them. But I do want to leave the language unmolested as it has sat for 230 years.
Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman yield for another question?
I would, sir.
Will the gentleman yield?
I would, sir.
Gentleman yields.
Facing the scowl, I will ask the gentleman another question. Mr. Jefferson had his Declaration of Independence, a document which is not here before this body. And when he talked about changing the claim of natural law, I don't know that he was talking about changing the language, but changing the claim that a right of conscience was not part of nature. And he said that would be the undoing. But he does talk about the laws of nature and nature's God in the Declaration. So with respect to this statute, which we have on the wall behind me, which is not being changed insofar as there's no claim that conscience is no longer a natural right, other than the age of it, which I acknowledge some weight, what's wrong with using that term?
Mr. Speaker, may I respond?
I'm hoping you will, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Briefly. You don't have to be long.
I'll be brief. Sir, Mr. Speaker, I have no problem with reaffirming or using the word unalienable in some other context, adding a statute. I just don't want to do damage to a statute that has sat around for a very long time. For me, it shows respect to the people who wrote the statute, and indeed to the people who wrote the reaffirmation of the statute 70 years later, that we let their words lie as a reminder of the history of this great institution, and that if we want to reaffirm it, we do so in yet another section. That is the way that I would do it, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Danville, Ms. Marshall.
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion.
Okay.
I move the pending question.
Gentleman from Danville, Mr. Marshall moves the pending question. Those in favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The pending question is called for. Shall the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading? Those in favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Bills engrossed and passed to